Welcome to the Honey Haber Memorial Lecture. Thank you all for coming out to the Auraria campus in Tivoli. The philosophy department hosts this lecture every year. It is a memorial to Honey Haber, who was a professor in our department at the University of Colorado, Denver. Each year we invite a philosopher whose work we find important and challenging to come and engage with our philosophical community, and by philosophical community I mean everybody who showed up to do a little philosophy with us tonight, so welcome. This year, in addition to the generous gift of Honey Haber's parents, Charles and Millicent Haber, and they established this lecture series through a gift and the library that's in our department. We also have the support of the Philosophy Club and the Student Government Association, making possible the alumni reception that you've been enjoying and that I hope you will continue to enjoy this evening. And I want to thank three of our students in particular for seeking that support. Adam Blair, Ben Hillen, and Svetlana Yefimenko, who I don't think is here. But let's give them a round of applause. I'd also like to thank my co-organizer for the speaker series, Rob Metcalf, who's mid-room. I won't make you applaud for him. And if you'd like to know about more of our events, there's a sign up just outside the door, and put your email on and you can know we're doing stuff all year long. We do this one big lecture in the spring, but you're welcome into our department to do a little philosophy anytime. And last but not least, I'd like to thank the two people who consistently not only make our events happen, but make them happen with style. Our administrative assistant, Maria Race, who had to leave earlier, and our graduate assistant, Rachel Shanahan, who's in the room. So let's thank her. So this year's speaker is Lisa Gunther. Dr. Gunther is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Vanderbilt University. She's the author of numerous scholarly articles, as well as articles for newspapers and popular journals, as well as an avid blogger. Does avid seem accurate? Okay. Off and on. It seems like every day on new apps there's something by Lisa Gunther. She is the award-winning author of two books, The Gift of the Other, Levinas and the Politics of Reproduction, and Solitary Confinement, Social Death and Its Afterlives, which came out last year and was the recent focus of a Newsweek article in which the journalist declared the book lucid as hell, which, agreed, it's lucid as hell. In explaining the importance of Gunther's work for understanding that solitary confinement is torture, the author of that Newsweek article, Alexander Nazarian, notes that, quote, Gunther quotes as readily from those who've languished in the box, so the box is solitary confinement, as she does from philosophers, end quote. That engagement with people inside prisons does not end with quoting from them. Dr. Gunther is also one of the founding members of the REACH Coalition, and REACH, and I'm quoting from them now, is an organization for reciprocal education led by insiders on Tennessee's death row. Reciprocal education is based on the idea that everyone has something to teach and to learn. By sharing our experiences and ideas with others, we grow as individuals and as a community. And that's the end of the quote from their website. REACH Coalition is involved in many, many projects and has produced a book I recommend to you called So I Can Live, which is a collection of pieces by the people on death row who are part of REACH Coalition. So I thought it might be daunting to try to introduce you to a person who so shaped my life with her teaching, mentorship, activism, writing, and sense of humor, I might add. But I realized that you're now going to get to spend some time with her, with a scholar activist, so all I really need to do is ask you to help me welcome Lisa Gunther to give her talk, The Eugenics Structure of Mass Incarceration.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that lovely introduction. And I should mention that Dr. Sarah Tyson is also one of the founding members of REACH Coalition. So it was together with Sarah and with a few other people that we started our philosophy discussion group on death row. So the title of my paper today is The Eugenics Structure of Mass Incarceration, and I actually rewrote 3/4 of it on the plane here because I wanted to respond to, which is not necessarily what you should do, but I really wanted to because I wanted to respond to a situation that's going on in Tennessee right now, where there's a Senate bill that's on the desk of Governor Bill Haslam that could be signed into law this week that would criminalize the use of illegal drugs by pregnant women, and that could really criminalize in much farther widespread ways, basically pregnancy in Tennessee. So this is directly related to my topic, and I thought I would try to break down that legislation and say a little bit about what I think is at stake in it today. But I'll begin by talking about a situation in California that, for a reason that is not totally clear to me, has been circulating on Facebook lately, but it happened, the story was actually broke and the story came out a year ago. And it's about the coercive sterilization of women in California prisons. So you may have heard about this. So last summer, the Center for Investigative Reporting broke a story about the unauthorized sterilization of women in California prisons. Between 2006 and 2010, at least 148 women received tubal ligations that were not approved by a state medical care review committee as required under California law. And it's required under California law because California has a really egregious history of state-sanctioned sterilization. And so any tubal ligation or similar practice that is performed on someone in prison has to undergo the review of a medical board. These weren't. Another 10 prisoners were sterilized by other means. While all the women had signed consent forms for the procedures, some said they felt pressured to sign, or that they did so under misleading and coercive circumstances. Some were asked if they wanted basically they were asked, are we doing a sterilization today, as they were going under for a procedure. So as the anesthetic was dripping into their veins, and as they were, one woman was getting gallstones removed or something like this, it was not even related to her reproductive capacity. She was asked if she wanted to sign this document, and she said no, but having woken up from that surgery, she is still not sure if that procedure was performed on her and has requested her medical records to find out if they went ahead without her approval and sterilized her. In any case, whether or not written consent was obtained, the situation of imprisonment complicates issues of agency and choice for women behind bars, to the point where it's not clear what consent would mean in such a context. Cristina Cordero, age 34, spent 2 years at Valley State Prison for Women on a conviction for auto theft. She reports being pressured by Dr. James Heinrich, the prison's OB-GYN, to undergo tubal ligation after the birth of her son in 2006. She says, as soon as he found out that I have 5 kids, he suggested that I look into getting it done. The closer I got to my due date, the more he talked about it. He made me feel like a bad mother if I didn't do it. Now, Dr. Heinrich denies having coerced the women in his care, but he doesn't deny his support for the sterilization of women in prison, justifying the practice as, quote, an important service to poor women who face health risks in future pregnancies because of past cesarean sections, end quote, as well as a service to taxpayers who could, quote, save in welfare paying for these unwanted children as they procreated more. Dr. Heinrich added, if these women come a year or two later saying somebody forced me to have this done, that's a lie. That's somebody looking for the state to give them a handout. My guess is that the only reason you would do that is because you feel wronged or you want to stay on the state's dole for some reason. Heinrich's support for sterilization, the sterilization of indigent women in prison, follows more than a century of formal and informal eugenics projects in the US, targeting poor women, women of color, women with disabilities, and women whose sexual practices were considered deviant by doctors and policymakers. In addition to coercive sterilization, the history of American eugenics includes anti-miscegenation laws, selective immigration practices and policies, state-funded research and records offices, targeted social welfare policies, and even uneven access to birth control based on one's perceived race, class, ability, and sexuality. So we don't have formal eugenics programs now, but state welfare programs that fund Norplant or long-acting implanted forms of birth control have been criticized by many, I go like this because they actually plant things in your arm, has been criticized by many feminists as a form of coercive birth control because that is made available for free, whereas condoms and other sort of short-term, less invasive procedures and ways of preventing pregnancy are not funded for women on welfare. Some of the most outspoken supporters of eugenic reform have been first-wave feminists, including Margaret Sanger, founder of Planned Parenthood, who promoted access to birth control and abortion for poor, black, and otherwise apparently unfit people on the grounds that, quote, "we are paying for and even submitting to the dictates of an ever-increasing, unceasingly spawning class of human beings who never should have been born at all." That's from The Pivot of Civilization in 1922. While the rhetoric of fitness has fallen out of favor since the Nazis appropriated and radicalized American eugenics policies, it's not clear that the era of eugenic control for poor women of color has come to an end. Nor is it clear that contemporary mainstream feminism has adequate theoretical and political resources to deal with or even recognize its eugenicist past. Consider, for example, a statement by Dawn Martin, DAWN, the top medical manager at Valley State Prison for Women from 2005 to 2008, in response to reports of unauthorized sterilization under her watch. Martin admits that she collaborated with Dr. Heinrich to find ways of getting around the prison's rules and authorization structures to facilitate the sterilization of prisoners. The way they did this was by documenting sterilization procedures as medical necessity rather than as elective surgery. And if it's a medical necessity, it didn't have to go through the authorization process. Like Heinrich, Martin defends sterilization as a legitimate service for incarcerated women, but she adds her own feminist twist to the argument by representing sterilization, quote, as an empowerment issue for female inmates, providing them with the same options as women on the outside. Presumably, she means that incarcerated women's access to sterilization could translate into greater reproductive freedom for them on the outside. They would no longer have to worry about getting pregnant, paying for birth control, or getting access to abortion. In other words, incarcerated women would benefit from being relieved of the burden of having to manage their own reproductive capacity. This assumes, of course, that incarcerated women are so powerless and so ill-equipped to make their own responsible choices about their own reproductive capacities that the permanent elimination of their capacity to get pregnant and to give birth would count as a lifestyle improvement. One less thing to worry about. It also assumes that reproductive liberty can be equated with reproductive choice, which in turn can be equated with the choice to avoid becoming pregnant and giving birth. Otherwise, it's hard to imagine how sterilization, the irreversible removal of your capacity to choose to have a child or to choose not to, could be construed as having the same options as women on the outside. The conflation of reproductive liberty with freedom from pregnancy and motherhood reflects a dominant assumption of the mainstream pro-choice movement, to the extent that it is based on the right to privacy and structured around the interests of young white middle-class women. The slogan, "My body, my choice," implies an investment in the body as a type of property, private property, or even the quintessence of private property, in a way that has historically marginalized the concerns of poor women and women of color who may not have the wealth, the social standing, or even the desire to mobilize a property interest in their own bodies. At stake here is the very meaning of subjectivity, or personhood. Is the subject an autonomous mind in possession of a more or less valuable body? Or does this model of subjectivity already presuppose a particular social position based on historical legacies of privilege and domination? Basically, the argument that Andrea Smith in her book Conquest, Sexual Violence and Colonization, the answer to that question is yes. Like that if we approach reproductive justice from a reproductive choice framework and center the interests of young middle-class white women, then what we end up doing is reinscribing a kind of property interest in your own body and excluding those women who actually are most vulnerable to exploitation from the discourse that is meant to be in their name and for their sake. Activist groups such as Sister Song and Forward Together, as well as scholars such as Angela Davis, Dorothy Roberts, Andrea Smith, and Loretta Ross, have argued that reproductive justice in the Americas cannot be reduced to reproductive choice, let alone to access to abortion. but rather must be understood in the context of plantation slavery, genocidal campaigns to exterminate indigenous peoples, racist immigration policies, and ongoing eugenics projects to control the reproductive capacities of apparently unfit women and men. Considered within this context, the power to give birth and to raise a family is just as important for the survival, well-being, and empowerment of women as the power to avoid getting pregnant and giving birth. But if that's the case, then we would need to rethink the structure of subjectivity and intersubjectivity, moving beyond liberal models of individual self-possession and starting rather from a relational matrix of natality and kinship that supports or undermines our reproductive capacities. It gives them meaning. It's important to keep in mind that the women who were recently sterilized in California prisons did sign legal consent forms as individuals. What makes their sterilization unlawful is the absence of approval for these procedures by a state medical board. They didn't get daddy's permission to perform these procedures on these women. As long as we regard these women as individual subjects with the right to choose how to deal with their reproductive capacities of their own bodies, and as long as these bodies are understood as a form of private property, it would appear that there's nothing inherently wrong or problematic with the recent sterilization of women in California prisons. An administrative step might have been missed by prison officials. As long as the women signed individual consent forms, what more is there to say? Their body, their choice. I understand that there are liberal feminist models that are more relational and that are critical of a kind of an absolute focus on the individual. But I think that the pro-choice movement, insofar as it's grounded in and centers the interests of white middle-class women, remains implicated in the history of eugenics to the extent that it remains invested in any way in personhood as self-possession and possession of one's own body as a form of property. More broadly, in a bigger version of this project that would include both the initial version of this paper and also a cluster of other work that I've done around the relation between reproductive justice and slavery and incarceration. My bigger thesis is that the US prison system remains implicated in eugenics, not just at particular moments, but throughout the multiple interlocking structures that criminalize and incarcerate certain people, groups of people at disproportionate rates, both implicitly and explicitly controlling their power to have and to raise children. So in the first version of this paper, I went into some detail about supporting that claim, and I'll just sketch very briefly what I mean by it. If you put people behind bars in sex-segregated worlds for most of their reproductive lives, that is a way of preventing, I'm not saying that this is the intention behind incarceration, but the effect of it is preventing them from giving birth and also from maintaining, in many cases, meaningful relationships to the children that they already do have, and also to their broader kinship structures. High phone rates in prisons make this even harder. The distance of prisons from metropolitan areas where many of the people who are confined in those prisons also makes it very hard for families to stay in touch. And so there are many ways that both biological reproduction and social reproduction and the kind of maintenance of meaningful kinship family relationships is interrupted and undermined by the prison system. And given that that mass incarceration in the US disproportionately targets poor people and people of color, they are the ones who are most directly affected by that form of what I would call natal alienation, following the work of Orlando Patterson on slavery, where he says that slavery is not just reducing someone to property, it is condemning them to a kind of social death or radical exclusion from the social world, and that's only possible if they are already natally alienated or removed and extracted from supportive kinship relations, such that when you put that person in chains, there isn't a community that is not already also in chains that can come and fight for that person. So, in other words, the structure of the current US prison system is fundamentally eugenicist. It's a big claim. I'm not really going to make the argument for it beyond what I've already said, but I'm going to look at another site and another example of where I think this eugenicist structure of mass incarceration is at work, and that's in my home state, or the state where I reside, Tennessee. This eugenicist structure systematically prevents certain groups of people, primarily poor people and people of color. Those are those who are targeted for disproportionate police surveillance, arrest, and incarceration, from making basic decisions concerning their own reproductive capacities. So here's where we're going to go off-road and go to Tennessee. Consider another example, this time from Tennessee. At this very moment, Senate Bill 1391 is on the desk of Governor Bill Haslam, waiting to be signed into law. The bill passed with a clear majority in the House and the Senate, so there's no reason to expect that he wouldn't be inclined to sign it. The bill would modify the Tennessee Criminal Code to allow for criminal assault charges to be brought against women who use illegal narcotics while pregnant, should their drug use lead to the harm or death of their fetus or child. These charges could carry a penalty of up to 15 years in prison. The current criminal code already allows for assault charges to be brought against a third party who assaults a fetus, presumably by also assaulting a pregnant woman. So there are separate charges for assaulting a fetus, but the only way you can get to a fetus is through the body of the woman who is pregnant with that fetus, right? So Tennessee Code 39-13-107 is entitled Fetus as Victim. It falls under the part of the criminal code dealing with assaultive offenses. Subsection A reads, and here I'm going to apologize for reading to you parts of the criminal code, but I'm going to try to make it as clear as possible, just because it's so fun to track the changes that are being proposed here. Okay, subsection A. For the purposes of this part of the criminal code, another individual, another person, include human embryo or fetus at any stage of gestation in utero, when any such term refers to the victim of any act made criminal by this part. Okay, so that's already in the criminal code, and I'm just going to unpack that. So what it means is that any criminal assault charge, be it assault, aggravated assault, reckless endangerment, or vehicular assault, can be brought against someone who commits these acts against a fetus or embryo at any stage. But another subsection in the code explicitly excludes pregnant women and healthcare professionals from liability for assault for a fetus. Subsection C says, nothing in subsection A, the thing I just read, shall apply to any act or omission by a pregnant woman with respect to an embryo or fetus with which she is pregnant, or to any lawful medical or surgical procedure to which a pregnant woman consents, if it is performed by a healthcare professional who is licensed to perform such procedure. Okay, so this part of the criminal code was written in 1989. And the formulation is clearly meant to protect women and medical professionals from being charged with assault if they seek or deliver an abortion, or if something goes wrong with the pregnancy for whatever reason, resulting in harm or death to the fetus. Oh, sorry, that was the subsection from the 2013 code. And that itself is a rewriting of the 1989 criminal code, and it's a watered down version of that initial 1989 version, which first introduced the category of the fetus as a possible victim of assault. Back then, in 1989, this subsection of the criminal code was called viable fetus as victim. So already the 2013 version got rid of viable and just put fetus as victim. And the earlier version from 1989 explicitly defended the woman's right to a legal abortion. So I'll read you the earlier version. The earlier version is, it is the legislative intent of this section that it shall in no way affect abortion which is legal in Tennessee. Those words have been removed from that, from the 2013 version. And they would remain removed from the proposed revisions. This, and it continues, this section shall in no way apply to acts that are committed pursuant to usual and customary standards of medical practice during diagnostic or therapeutic treatment. So the 2013 revision of that subsection makes the word abortion disappear and substitutes instead a reference to any lawful medical or surgical procedure to which a pregnant woman consents, performed by a healthcare professional who is licensed to perform such a procedure. And given that licensing for abortion providers has been really restricted, not so much in law, but through policy modifications that require abortion clinics to have a certain square footage and to have certain, plumbing regulations, and also that require abortion providers to have access to, and what do you call it when you're allowed to? Admitting, privileges at a local hospital. That also further restricts women's access to abortion, especially in the South. There's only one operating abortion clinic in all of Mississippi right now. So State Bill 1391 would keep this formulation that I just read, but it would add a further restriction on the protection of pregnant women from criminal prosecution for assaulting their own fetus. It would add the word lawful to subsection C, resulting in the following formulation. It would now read, nothing in subsection A, which allows for assault charges to be brought against people who assault a fetus, shall apply to any lawful act or lawful omission by a pregnant woman with respect to an embryo or fetus with which she is pregnant. Now, this adding of the word lawful might seem like a minor revision, but it could have drastic consequences for women in Tennessee and for women across the U.S. if other states adopt similar legislation. Imagine the following scenario. A pregnant sex worker is assaulted by her John. Under the 2013 code, as well as the 1989 code, he could be charged with 2 counts of assault, one against her, one against her fetus. But if SB 1391 were signed into law, what would protect the woman herself from being charged with assault, or at least with reckless endangerment, on the grounds that she engaged in unlawful acts, sex work, while pregnant, which exposed her fetus to the risk of harm or death? Furthermore, what counts as an unlawful act in a state where cities and towns are allowed to criminalize the survival strategies of the poor and homeless, such as sleeping in public? Or where ordinances against loitering, trespassing, and so forth are selectively enforced against poor people and or people of color? If a homeless woman's pregnancy ends in a miscarriage, or if her child is born with some kind of impairment, could she be charged with assault since she engaged in unlawful acts while pregnant? And what counts as a lawful or unlawful omission? If a woman's on parole or probation and she misses a parole meeting while pregnant, then has a miscarriage in an unrelated moment, or the child is born impaired for whatever reason, then could she be charged with assault? What if she's in a car accident and is found to have unlawfully omitted the wearing of a seatbelt? Could she be charged with assault against her fetus? One might object that these scenarios are extreme, and they fall outside the intended or imagined consequences of the law. But laws have all kinds of unintended consequences, especially in a legal system where prosecutors have almost unchecked power to bring any plausible charge against a defendant, either in order to force a plea bargain or to punish a person to the full extent of the law. Those who are most socially marginalized, poor people, people of color, people with disabilities, and so forth, precisely the targets of eugenics, are also the most likely to be charged and punished more harshly than others, who already enjoy social and legal protection, and who already also have kind of like social and political networks that are able to have a voice in coming to their aid. This is why we must put the most marginalized people at the center of our analysis if we're going to examine the implications of policies and legislation to see where the follow really is. The implications of this potential revision to the Tennessee Criminal Code already give us cause for concern. But SB 1391 doesn't stop there. It also proposes to add a new subsection to the Criminal Code. Section C of SB 1391 reads, notwithstanding subdivision C1, and that's the section that we were just looking at, the one that offers limited protection for pregnant women from charges of assault as long as they have not engaged in any unlawful acts or omissions that are judged to have caused harm or death to the fetus. Notwithstanding that, nothing in this section shall preclude prosecution of a woman for assault for the illegal use of a narcotic drug while pregnant if her child is born addicted to or harmed by the narcotic drug, and the addiction or harm is a result of her illegal use of a narcotic drug taken while pregnant. So in plain language, if a woman uses illegal drugs while pregnant and her fetus is harmed, addicted, or killed as a result of this drug use, she could face criminal assault charges. No mention is made about the grounds on which a causal relation would be determined between her drug use and the harm. But again, we can be sure that the most socially marginalized women would be most harshly affected by this subdivision of the bill. The main sponsor and spokesperson for SB 1391 is a white woman, Representative Terry Lynn Weaver, Republican from Lancaster County. According to Weaver, the bill is meant to act as what she calls a velvet hammer for what she calls the worst of the worst, by which she means hardcore addicts who use cocaine and heroin while pregnant. So she explicitly said this is meant to punish women who use cocaine and heroin. But narcotic drug is not defined in the criminal code as cocaine or heroin. It is defined as controlled substances more generally. Apparently, Representative Weaver has not heard about the meth epidemic in rural Tennessee. Like that is, if you want to talk about like drug problems in Tennessee, it's meth. It's not so much cocaine and heroin. And different people are affected. It's like the rural or white population that is more directly affected by meth use in Tennessee. And I would imagine that the people in her own county would be struggling with meth more directly than with cocaine and heroin addictions. But Weaver's focus on cocaine and heroin as examples of hardcore drugs remains keyed into a decades-old moral panic around so-called crack babies. Remember those? The discourse on crack babies was particularly intense in the 1990s, when some pregnant women, mainly impoverished women of color, found themselves charged with charges like child abuse or distributing drugs to a minor for using illegal drugs while pregnant. Dorothy Roberts has done amazing work on this. Her book, Killing the Black Body, as well as Rachel Roth, Making Women Pay, is an excellent book on this whole phenomenon. Recent studies have shown that poverty has a much more detrimental effect on child development than prenatal drug use, and that crack or powder cocaine may be even less harmful to the fetus than alcohol or tobacco use while pregnant. But like many of the crusaders of the 90s version of the war on pregnant women, Representative Weaver supports her bill with emotional expressions of maternal care and suffering rather than with scientific evidence. She told reporters, "I've held and rocked these babies. I just want to bawl, I just want to cry. It's wrong. These babies are meant to come into the world addicted to mommy's milk and not to cocaine or heroin." So this is the political discourse around the bill. I might not go back, you all. Weaver attributes similar emotions to state law enforcement officers. She says, "It's heartbreaking if you're a police officer and you see a woman who's 7 or 8 months pregnant and shooting heroin. There's an individual inside that belly that has no choice but to take whatever goes into it. As long as it remains inside that belly, the fetus, understood as an individual with no choice, is in a most dangerous place." And here I'm kind of referencing this whole billboard campaign that, I don't know if you all heard about it, but across the US, especially across the South, but also in Manhattan, these billboards were put up. There's one of an adorable 7-year-old black girl in a pink dress, and it says, "The most dangerous place for a young black child is in the mother's womb." And it's, yeah, oh yeah, Google this, you know. And these were sponsored by pro-life groups that were especially lobbying against the abortion, comparing the abortion of black babies to slavery and genocide. Weaver explains, so yeah, I'll get actually back to that briefly later on, but this is a meme that has gone through the Republican Party and the Tea Party. Mike Huckabee and Sarah Palin, and it goes back to Ronald Reagan, who all mobilized this discourse around the abolition of abortion is the new equivalent of the abolition of slavery. that slavery was a human rights crusade that apparently white men undertook to liberate their black brothers and sisters, and that we would be the Wilberforces of today. I'm not making this up. This is like a quote. We would be the Wilberforces of today if we abolished abortion, because that is the new front of slavery. Why? I mean, think about that, what that implies for the representation of a black woman's body. It basically puts her in the position of a slave owner who holds a monstrous sovereign power over her own fetus, the power to kill and to let live, as Foucault defines sovereign power. So they're equating a woman's relation to her own fetus with a black woman's relation to her own fetus with a white slave owner's relation to his black slave. It's totally messed up. So Weaver explains her position on the issue. She says, here's the double standard. If I hit a lady who's pregnant, and they're both, the mother and the fetus, are killed, that's 2 counts of homicide. But if a woman who is pregnant can stab herself in the stomach and hurt her baby and not be charged with anything, that's a double standard. Like, think of, it's just amazing. And so she says, the Safe Harbor Act, which was passed last year, made a woman who was pregnant above the law. Women are enshrined by law to have the right to stab themselves in the stomach and get away with it. Now, the Safe Harbor Act of 2013 is one of the more progressive pieces of legislation to come out of Tennessee in recent years, but unfortunately there's not a whole lot of competition for that role. According to Reality Check, the act, quote, created incentives to get pregnant women who use drugs into treatment programs and guaranteed that so long as the women continued their treatment, their newborns could not be taken away by the Department of Children's Services solely because of their drug use. So it creates safe harbor for women who may use drugs but who are committed to undergoing a treatment program. Good law, good direction. The Safe Harbor Act was passed in response to a dramatic rise in cases of what is called neonatal abstinence syndrome, or NAS, in Tennessee. It's risen tenfold in the last 10 years in Tennessee. NAS refers to a cluster of symptoms similar to withdrawal, which are observable in some newborn infants. According to Representative Weaver, infants with NAS, quote, look like Gerber babies, but their whole mechanics are twisted. They'll never be the same. But according to medical experts, such as Dr. Kathy Hartke of the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, the effects of NAS are temporary and reversible. In any case, the Safe Harbor Act only applies to women who have used prescription drugs, not to women who use or use illegal drugs. The main sponsor of Safe Harbor, Senator Ken Yeager, Republican from Harriman County, who incidentally is the same person who sponsored a bill to bring back the electric chair, which is also on the government's desk right now. Yeager explained to reporters that he restricted the scope of the bill in order to target, quote, a small population. A law that is too broad, he said, could make so many pregnant mothers eligible that preventive treatment costs would sink the whole effort altogether. God forbid that too many pregnant women should get the treatment they need, or that the state should support their efforts to get clean, both for their own sake and for the sake of the fetus. The restricted scope of the Safe Harbor Act introduces a biopolitical cut between those who must live and reproduce and those who may die and or be punished. So I'm bringing in the language, Foucault's language of state racism from Society Must Be Defended, in which he defines, he asks, what happens in a political economy where sovereign power is no longer the dominant form of power, but rather this biopower, which is a power to make live, to support the flourishing of certain populations, and to let die, or to kind of neglect and allow to die and undergo harm, but not really interfere too much with other parts of the population. And Foucault says, how do you actually legitimate killing part of the state, whether it's for state execution or even letting die in a political economy that is committed to supporting life and making life flourish. And he says it's through state racism. It's through making a kind of biopolitical cut between those who must live the lives that have to flourish in order for the whole community to benefit, and those who can be allowed to just die out or be neglected. And that is a eugenic structure. That's what I'm calling the eugenicist structure of mass incarceration. The selective application of safe harbor is evident in the language used to describe the plight of pregnant women who abuse prescription drugs, as opposed to the worst of the worst who abuse and use illegal narcotics. So listen to the difference in language when we're talking about these women who deserve the support and safe harbor of the state. Tennessee Health Commissioner John Drazener recognizes that when it comes to prescription drug abuse, quote, we can't arrest our way out of the problem. Tell that to the crafters, like to Rockefeller and the crafters of the war on drugs. We can't arrest our way out of the problem. Okay. Senator Yeager, electric chair guy, agrees. We've got to give people an incentive to get cleaned up. Agreed. Wow, I have so much common ground with these people. It's awesome. And yet the state also recognizes that solving problems costs money. And it worries about wasting money on those whose lives seem unlikely to contribute to the state's overall health and prosperity. So it mobilizes the language of care and punishment to produce and reproduce a division between the deserving and the undeserving, the innocent and the guilty, the redeemable or rehabilitatable, those who respond well to incentives, and the irredeemable, the pill poppers and the hardcore addicts. It offers safe harbor, positive incentives and treatment to the former, and it uses the hammer, velvet or otherwise, of criminalization, arrest, incarceration, and possible termination of parental rights on the latter. Wally Kirby, Executive Director of the Tennessee District Attorneys General Conference, a very powerful group in Tennessee, explains the rationale for excluding illegal drug users from access to safe harbor from the perspective of law enforcement. He was very much in support of this bill, but wanted further amendments, and that's where Senate Bill 1391 comes in. Wally Kirby says, we don't have a problem with these mothers trying to get treatment and trying to get help. But if we have a child that's damaged because of this drug injection or stillborn, we need the ability to prosecute those ladies. Whether identified as those ladies or that belly, women of color and or poor women are most likely to be prosecuted under this new law. To make matters worse, it's not even clear that Tennessee has the infrastructure to allow women to comply with the order to undertake a drug treatment program to avoid facing criminal charges for the assault of their fetus, even with safe harbor. According to The Guardian, which thankfully has reported on this, as well as NPR and the New York Times, so we're getting like coverage outside of Tennessee. The Guardian says there are 177 addiction treatment centers in Tennessee. Only 2 offer prenatal care on site. Only 19 provide any services at all for pregnant women. And this is something that was an issue in the 90s as well, when women were given the alternative, okay, get clean or face prosecution for distributing drugs to a minor. Dorothy Roberts and Rachel Roth have documented this just like beautifully. That at the time that women were being given this order, there were almost no, and sometimes no, facilities in the state that would even accept pregnant women. Because for liability reasons, a lot of drug treatment centers will just say, we don't take drug-addicted pregnant women because there are too many issues with that. You need specialized care. It's precisely that. You need specialized care, but to order someone to seek treatment in a situation where there's no meaningful access to treatment, and then to punish those women for failing to get help is a decades-old problem, and it's a problem that brings to mind Malcolm X's critique of, quote, a society that will crush people and then penalize them for not being able to stand up under the weight. It would be hard to find a clearer expression of the eugenic logic of mass incarceration than the pairing of the Safe Harbor Act with Senate Bill 1391. There are two There are two mutually reinforcing approaches to eugenics. Positive eugenics, or the promotion of reproduction for groups of people thought to possess desirable traits, and negative eugenics, or the restriction, discouragement, and prevention of reproduction for other groups thought to possess undesirable traits. A binary opposition between the fit and unfit, normal and abnormal, valued and devalued, underwrites both approaches to eugenics, and it maps onto the logic of what I would call social death, following the work not only of Orlando Patterson, but also of Lisa Cacho, who defines social death as a process by which some groups are rendered, quote, ineligible for personhood and beyond ethical obligation for the sake of protecting the life, liberty, and property of others. The logic of social death, like the logic of positive and negative eugenics, divides the social world into those whose lives and reproductive capacities must be protected, and those who may be excluded from protection and or against whom the lives and reproductive capacities of others must be protected. As examples of the unprotected, Cacho focuses in her book, called Social Death, on the social and legal construction of categories like gang member, suspected terrorist, illegal alien, as subjects or non-subjects or canceled subjects who are criminalized before the crime, not on the basis of what they have done or failed to do, but rather on the basis of who they are or are perceived to be in the present, and the crimes that they are expected to commit in the future. So there's a kind of prognosis, what do you call it in insurance, where you do there's a kind of actuarial logic to this. She explains, those who are marked for social death, are the people against whom the law must discriminate in order to protect everyone else against discrimination. In other words, legal equality is possible for everyone else because criminalized populations of color are ineligible for rights and personhood. This is just exactly the logic, I think, that is at stake in Safe Harbor and Senate Bill 1391. I want to extend Cacho's framework to consider the pregnant women who are framed by Weaver as hardcore addicts and as the worst of the worst, as specifically feminized and racialized examples of social death with a eugenic twist. And the thing about this is that because personhood or citizenship is framed as having to be constructed and protected against those against whom we must against those who we must punish and control and contain in order for citizenship and equality and freedom to be possible, then no one is unaffected by this. The structure of citizenship is fundamentally constituted in relation to the exclusion of certain labeled others, dangerous individuals. These women, singled out by Weaver and Yeager as the worst of the worst, are criminalized not only for what they have done, and not only for who they are, but also, I think, for the specter of the other to whom they might give birth. This is something that I wasn't able to follow through yet, but they're framed in advance, I think, as both dangerous to themselves and others, and also as what Ellen Feder calls, following Foucault, the dangerous person's mother. And there's all this weird, like, biopolitical eugenic discourse about why did violent crime rates go down in the 80s and in the 90s? It's because there were more abortions, because with Roe v. Wade, this is a Freakonomics argument. Right. More abortions among poor women and women of color led to fewer births, which led to less violent crime, because we all know where violent crime comes from, out of the belly of the most dangerous place. So I want to, like, in the bigger version of this project, kind of analyze that discourse. How does this language of social death help us to understand the eugenic logic of mass incarceration in the specific case of Tennessee's SB 1391? In a nutshell, by extending legal protection, along with social recognition and empathy, to women who use or abuse prescription drugs while pregnant, and both withholding this protection from women who use illegal narcotics, and further exposing them to criminal assault charges should anything go wrong with their pregnancy, whether or not it is actually caused by their drug use. SB 1391, together with the Safe Harbor Act, inscribe within the law a division between protected and unprotected classes, which maps onto divisions between desirable and undesirable, valued and devalued, normal and abnormal, redeemable and irredeemable. In so doing, these legislative initiatives reinforce existing divisions and inequalities based on race, class, and access to health care. And it also continues a centuries-old pattern of what my colleague at Vanderbilt, Colin Diane, calls civil death, in which she traces through the logic and history of slavery, incarceration, and torture in the War on Terror. Civil death for Diane is a legal construction of a status that is both excluded from protection under the law and also exposed to disproportionate punishment under the law. You lose and lose. What looks like a velvet hammer, care-based violence, or tough love, might actually be a compounded form of violence made even more insidious by the language of care. So there's much more to be said about all of this, but I'll close by saying a few words. I can either close now and just urge you to sign the petition at realitycheck.org, or I have like 3.5 more pages on reproductive justice, which I think is the framework through which we should be analyzing these. Can we continue? Okay. Thank you. I also want to urge you to support Sister Reach, which is a grassroots organization for reproductive justice based in Memphis, Tennessee, which works with the reproductive justice framework, and also Healthy and Free Tennessee, which is a coalition for sexual health and reproductive freedom in Tennessee. So those are people who've been working on these issues for many years in some cases, and working really hard on SB 1391, trying to get that vetoed. Okay, so this has all been very depressing. Now we're going to end on a high note. I'm glad you let me go on, because we can end on a higher note. If we want to critique and dismantle the eugenicist structure of the US prison system, which is also a structure of civil death and social death, and may actually be not just the structure of the US prison system, but the US structure of the US. Stop. Then we need to confront and dismantle the historical alliance between eugenics and the birth control movement, and to decenter as feminists, from a feminist perspective. We need to decolonize and de-eugenicize feminism, and decenter the subject position of white middle-class women as the default subject of feminism. By centering the perspectives of those who are most marginalized and therefore most exposed to poverty, racism, abuse, criminalization, incarceration, and more abuse at the hands of the prison system, then our critique of legislation like SB 1391 or practices such as sterilization behind bars, unless we do that, that was a mistake, our critiques will remain incomplete and ineffective. So what we need is a reproductive justice framework for our analysis. What does this mean? Reproductive justice is a discourse developed by women of color activists and scholars, which offers vital resources for dismantling the eugenic structure of mass incarceration and creating new possibilities for what I call natal resistance, which would be the resistance to natal alienation, and resurgence. And the resurgence is a word that I get from Leanne Simpson, who's an Indigenous scholar, an Anishinaabe scholar in Canada. She wrote a beautiful book called Dancing on Our Turtle's Back. The reproductive justice movement emerged in the mid-1990s as a critical response to the mainstream pro-choice movement's narrow focus on the priorities of young, middle-class white women. Influenced by the human rights discourse of third world feminists, a Black Women's Caucus convened at the Illinois Pro-Choice Alliance Conference in 1994 to develop a conceptual and political framework for reproductive justice that moved beyond the reproductive choice framework and connected reproductive rights to broader struggles for social justice. This group was called Women of African Descent for Reproductive Justice. And in 1997, they joined with other women of color and Indigenous women to form the Sister Song Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective. Sister Song defines reproductive justice in terms of, quote, the right to have children, not to have children, and to parent the children we have in safe and healthy environments. Note the breadth of this definition. It includes not only the right to reproductive choice in the sense of a range of options for preventing pregnancy or terminating pregnancy, but also the right to have children and to raise them in a way that supports the mutual flourishing of parents and children. The activist group Emerge, which stands for Expanding the Movement for Empowerment and Reproductive Justice, situates their account of the reproductive justice movement within an explicitly intersectional framework that centers the concerns of those who are most directly affected by reproductive injustice. They write, that reproductive justice aims to transform power inequalities and create long-term systemic change, and it therefore relies on the leadership of communities most impacted by reproductive oppression. The reproductive justice framework recognizes that all individuals are part of communities, and that our strategies must lift up entire communities in order to support individuals. The subject of the reproductive justice movement is therefore not an isolated rights-bearing individual. Although her rights to have children, not to have children, and to raise the children she has are nevertheless a key point of legal and political struggle for the movement. But these rights must be understood and embodied in an intersectional framework and context where relational subjectivity is shaped and reshaped by mutually defining formations of race, class, gender, sexuality, and ability. Moreover, the negative or critical work of dismantling eugenicist structures of valuation must be complemented by a positive movement of affirmation and support for the relational, intersectional subjectivity of women and girls understood as members of the community and political actors in a common world. This common world language refers to the earlier version of my paper, which addressed, tried to put Hannah Arendt into conversation with reproductive justice and to think about natality in relation. So this account of relational subjectivity would be grounded in part on reproductive justice discourses and in part drawing on resources within philosophy more narrowly understood, such as Hannah Arendt's account of natality. In a text called A New Vision from 2005, Asian Communities for Reproductive Justice, which is now known as Forward Together, defines reproductive justice as, quote, the complete physical, mental, spiritual, political, economic, and social well-being of women and girls. So that, what is at stake there is social reproduction just as much as biological reproduction. And it's also reproduction in the sense of reproducing and being able to thrive as the person that you are, whether or not you decide to have children. As someone who is a political actor within a context of natal relationality. They argue, we need a movement with a vision of addressing women wholly and comprehensively so that we do not single out pieces of a woman's body, but see their bodies as a whole. Similarly, we cannot focus on one sole aspect of a woman's life, whether at work, at home, at school, or on the streets. We need to understand how reproductive oppression may exist in all arenas of her life, and recognize that she may have to walk through all of those arenas in a single day. This vision of reproductive justice calls for a political movement that affirms and supports the relational structure of natal intersubjectivity and amplifies this structure through the collective political action of women and girls under the leadership of those who are most directly affected by the eugenicist structures of oppression. I propose to call this a movement of natal resistance, both dismantling the structures of social death and natal alienation, and also affirming the power of natality or relational person. This statement by Asian Communities for Reproductive Justice summarizes the liberatory vision of reproductive justice, and this is where I'll close. They write, under conditions of reproductive justice, we will live in homes free from sexual and physical violence. We will live and work without fear of sexual harassment. We will have safe work and home environments protected from corporate exploitation and environmental toxins. We will be free from hatred due to sexual identity. We will be valued for all the forms of work we do. We will earn equitable and livable wages. We will eat healthy and affordable food. And we will have comprehensive health care for ourselves and our families. Moreover, the government and private institutions will support our decisions whether or not to have a child, and we will receive the necessary support for our choices. In addition, we will receive an education that honors and teaches the contributions of women, people of color, working class communities, and queer and transgender communities. So this vision is so all-inclusive. It's obviously a utopian vision, but it gives us a different way of thinking about reproduction, not as kind of like what happens to your parts or in your parts, but as, like in a much more integrated way as the way that we respond to and support and are supported in our flourishing as members of the community. I think that the reproductive justice framework developed by Sister Song and other women of color activists and scholars helps us to navigate the issues raised by the recent sterilization of women in California prisons and by the proposed bill to criminalize pregnancy for women in Tennessee. It also helps to connect these issues to broader social struggles that affect all women and all human beings, whether or not they've been incarcerated and whether or not they've ever considered having children of their own. Their affirmation of women of color's collective and individual power of self-organizing and self-determination is rooted in a radical critique of oppression and in a commitment to social transformation, which recognizes both the strategic position of women of color in eugenic campaigns and also the power of women to analyze, resist, and transform these structures. But they cannot accomplish this transformation alone. It's the responsibility of white women, especially white feminists, to educate ourselves about the history of eugenics, the complicity of feminism with that history, its contemporary legacy, and its underlying logic, in order to resist the structures that undermine the possibility of reproductive justice for us all.
Yes, please.
First of all, thank you so much. This was wonderful.
Thank you.
And before you say that you're going to stay here, you should know about a bill that's on the floor right now in our Senate that's being considered called the Drug Endangered Child Bill.
Oh, really?
Very similar, although it's less specifically geared towards pregnant women and more towards parents. And it's really in this reaction since Amendment 64 passed and marijuana has been legalized. And basically says that, so it was originally proposed as a bill that would protect against the per se rule that if you have any drugs around a child at all, then they are automatically endangered or abused or neglected. So supposedly it protects people who just have stuff around, like, for example, middle-class white people who have a bunch of prescriptions and children in the house. But what it in fact does is add to the criminal statute. And it doesn't actually add anything. So the conduct would be the same essentially as what the abuse and neglect statute already prescribes as illegal. But it just throws in, and if there's drugs around, here's another charge that you can throw against people and use it to try and coerce people into plea deals. So Colorado is not that much ahead of Tennessee.
Where's the safe harbor?
But I guess in saying that, I also want to let people know that there is a new coalition that is formed to try and battle these kinds of things, specifically around mass incarceration. It's very broad. If you're interested, come talk to me afterwards. I don't want to take up too much more time, but thanks.
Cool, thank you. What is it, does the new coalition have a name?
That's really funny because we're going through a branding process right now. No, we
It's hard to
don't.
come up with names.
Right, well, so if you're interested in looking for it, our blog is Colorado Mass Incarceration Coalition.blogspot.com.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I appreciate what you had to say today. And, you know, in terms of that billboard,
Yeah, right.
the most dangerous place for a black child is inside of the womb of its mother.
Yeah.
I just always found it so interesting how much they care about black children in the womb, and when they
Yes.
get out, it's like,
Yes.
you know,
Suddenly that's a dangerous individual, so
Yeah,
you're out
yeah, like-
beyond the age of
as
9.
soon as he gets out, it's like cuff him.
Right.
And I think that the allegiance now with the understanding of slavery and structure
Yeah.
is these laws are just like if you harm a pregnant slave,
Yes.
you're harming the property of the slave master and must incur a punishment.
Yeah.
And I just sometimes wonder what we're going to do about this system's seemingly compulsive addiction to replicate slave behavior.
Right.
You know, slave ownership behavior and stuff like
Yeah.
that. So, in terms of addressing it, I just appreciate the work that you're doing. And, yeah, I'm willing to help anybody who's working aggressively. So.
Thank you for that. And another amazing thing that's happening right now is the Free Alabama movement. Have you all heard about this? This is in Alabama prisons. It's directly related to prisons the people who are most directly affected by mass incarceration, namely people who are in this case, Alabama prisons, forced to work without compensation for their labor. If they do kitchen work, or like most people in Alabama prisons are not paid anything for their labor. And we have to remember that the 13th Amendment does not abolish slavery for people who have been duly convicted of a crime. It still does, there is still a, enshrined in the Constitution, in the Bill of Rights, legitimate form of slavery which happens in prisons. And the Free Alabama movement is a movement that I just heard about the same day. I heard about this bill and the Free Alabama movement on Friday. It's been a very intense weekend. And so the Free Alabama movement is organized by people in Alabama prisons, and they reject the prison slavery to which they've been subjected. And they've staged 3 labor strikes at 3 different prisons. They started their campaign in January, but it's clear from their organization, like Google Free Alabama Movement, they have a Facebook page, they have a Twitter account, they have a website, and they have a 100-page document that is an analysis of prison slavery in Alabama. So that's an example of people who are most directly affected by prison slavery saying, we reject this, we're organized, and we're going to use the reason why we are incarcerated is so that we can provide free labor for the prison system. And we're going to undermine that by refusing to lend our labor. Now they put the leader of that movement, Melvin Ray, into solitary confinement since January, since the first labor strike. But I am sure that he knew that that was going to happen, and that, you know, it's a very well organized movement, and a lot of it is conducted through networks through contraband cell phones. They've done videos and they've taken pictures of rats in the shower, and they have a video of this disgusting meat patty that has like different colors. They just take it apart and show the disgusting food, because you can be told prison food is disgusting. And you're like, yeah, I'm sure it is. But then you see this stuff. This is why the cell phone, one of the reasons why cell phones are contraband in prisons, so that people who are in prisons cannot show what's going on in there. But that's a very inspiring movement.
I was just curious, when you were talking about California and the sterilization
Yeah.
of women in being jailed, that idea of the forced choice, you know, they were kind of forced to sign the petition, but then also needing permission from the
Yes.
higher up, and it seemed really kind of paradoxical, because on one hand you seem like you're getting a choice, and on the other hand you really don't.
Right.
Could you speak a little bit more about that topic?
Yeah, I think it speaks to like who is actually authorized to make a choice, a meaningful choice. So if you are, and it kind of mirrors something that happened in California prisons during the Pelican Bay and broader hunger strikes in California prisons last summer. So during those hunger strikes in the beginning stages, the California Department of Corrections went around and gave everybody these end-of-life consent forms that are advance directives, where you're supposed to sign this to refuse medical care if you become unconscious. And so that's a kind of like, here you are, individual, plucked out of your situation, here's your contract, here's your forced choice. Sign this waiver, and you basically consent to die because you refuse, if you are engaged in a hunger strike and you refuse to be re-fed, eventually you will die. So you either sign this and consent to die, or don't sign it and consent to be force-fed, because we are telling you right now that we're going to refeed you if you don't sign the consent form. Okay, fine. Lots of people signed the consent form. Then they went to the courts, and they said, Papa Court, Papa Judge, could you delegitimate the voices of these prisoners who as individuals signed these consent forms that we've basically made them sign or not sign in a forced choice, because we don't want to have on our hands either people dying or having to force feed them, and so we want to be the ones in control. We don't want to give even the prisoners who signed the form enough agency to decide, this is how I'm going to choose to die. So they went to the district court, and they got an order which allowed the Department of Corrections to annul and cancel the authorization of any end-of-life form that they thought was signed under coercion. And then there are all kinds of, so the specter, the fear was, the panic was, gang members are coercing vulnerable people to sign these things. And there were perhaps some examples where that had happened. In any case, there's just like such a fraught discourse around gang members, security threat groups, and this kind of like selective paternalism of the California Department of Corrections, where suddenly, as long as we can play you off of this other person, we want to care for you. It's again this eugenic logic of the state is offering you care and protection from coercive gang members. And what is the term of that? That we disregard and cancel the legal significance of the document that, if you were anyone else, would have legally binding force.
Unless you're pregnant, potentially violent.
Unless you're pregnant. Yeah. Yeah. So that's a forced choice, and it's also a forced choice that ultimately there's this higher authority, whether it's a court or a board of medical doctors who oversee procedures from a distance, who are authorized to legitimate or delegitimate your choice, should they decide that they know what's better for you than you do. So there might be some cases in which a woman actually does say, do you know what, I have 5 kids, I don't want to have any more, I really don't, and it might not be the best solution in the world, but I do, as the person who I am, in the position that I'm in, I do choose to have a tubal ligation, and I will sign that form, and I really do want it. That person's request could be canceled by the medical board, because it's up to them ultimately to sanction it or not sanction it. So it's kind of like, we'll give you a voice, but we'll take it away if you don't say what we want you to say with it.
I love the conversation about putting the most marginalized people at the center of the analysis if we really want to take a look at how policies are affected. And I also get, when I attend presentations and talks and workshops where you're doing work that's specific to a particular group, that group gets it. Like women get it.
Right.
Women of color get it. How do we get white men to get it?
Good question. White man, would you like to? Yeah.
See what I mean?
I think there's a gender division of labor in prison activism and prison scholarship. And I mean, there are gender divisions of labor around scholarship and activism generally, but something that I've just noticed, and I don't know what to do with this observation, yet, but it bears further unpacking. Almost all of the women who do prison education, almost all of the people I know who do prison education are white women. Almost all of the people who do prison activism and who are doing kind of like the most powerful grassroots organizing and getting direct, concrete results are women of color. Almost many, not almost all, but many of the people I know who do scholarly academic work on prisons but don't engage in prison education or activism are white men. So what's that division of labor and along race and gender lines all about?
Orlando Patterson opened my eyes to the way that Greek tragedy co-opted the pain of the female slave
Right.
to find freedom for the next 2,000 years for
Yes.
white men.
Yes, yes. So I would say that if the structure of negative eugenics targets very specifically women of color, poor women, women with disabilities, women with non-normative sexual practices, then the target of positive eugenics is white women imagined as vessels or vehicles for the self-reproduction of white men. So the logic of eugenics is so heavily gendered that we might not see where black men and white men come into that. But I think that that's part of, I think, the value of thinking of eugenics in a very broad way and thinking of practices that seem maybe not to have very much to do with reproduction, like education or like healthcare more generally. To think about what does a critical eugenic framework allow us to see and not see in those contexts. And we might see, if we approach it from a certain way, that the position of subjectivity, of default subjectivity, this unmarked, neutral citizen, which is implicitly a white, middle-class male, a property male, that is kind of like the model for citizenship in the US, is precisely the counterpoint to the dangerous individual or the dangerous individual's mother, and that if we don't get that conversation going, then we won't be able to dismantle that whole system that is built upon it.
So it was a fascinating talk. I really appreciated it. And I want to learn more about what you were calling natal intersubjectivity. And in particular, I'm wondering about the place of culture and specifically religion, inherited religious tradition in natal intersubjectivity. How is there place to theorize inherited cultural practices and beliefs within the sense of intersubjectivity?
Yes, I think so. So when I say natal intersubjectivity, I kind of am referencing my first book, which is trying to think through what it means to be born to another, and I think what is not in my first book that really should have been, or you can't do everything, is a more robust account of social reproduction and precisely those social and cultural, religious or spiritual inheritances that reproduce not just individuals, because we're not just individuals, but reproduce individuals and communities as social beings and as social entities. And so that's something that kind of really comes to the fore in relation to incarceration, is to what extent can people, and to what extent is the social reproduction of people behind bars obstructed, and to what extent, in what ways, do people manage to engage in social reproduction? Very robust, amazing cultural and social reproduction, often through practices, religious practices, even in the tightest of circumstances. So I think this notion that I have just kind of started thinking about, of not just natal resistance, but natal resurgence, is, as I said, borrowed from Leanne Simpson's book, Dancing on Our Turtle's Back. And she talks about, she says, as an Anishinaabe woman speaking to elders, and as someone who kind of came back to her Anishinaabe culture and language in her 20s, and as a language learner, and someone who's kind of like reconnecting with that inheritance. She would have conversations with elders, and coming from a kind of academic, like a social theory perspective that she gained in like a Western university, she'd always be talking about resistance, critical resistance, critiquing resistance. And the elders were like, not so excited about this language of resistance and critique. And so at first she sort of felt like, well, I have to educate them about the importance of resistance and critique. And then kind of thought, oh, there's something for me to learn here about the limits of critique as a negative process that is attached to what it is critiquing. And I think we could learn from Nietzsche about this too, like about the sorts of forms of resentment, or the way that if you are constantly struggling against something and obsessed with that thing, that struggle will shape you too. And so the elders were saying, we don't need resistance, and we need rebirth. We need to, like go back to and revitalize the roots of our culture and our religious practices and our language. And from that, not return to it as kind of some fetishized, antique, dead cultural form that we're nostalgic for and that we have to enshrine in the museum or something like that, but really revitalize those roots. And so Leanne Simpson comes up with this concept of resurgence, of a political practice and an aesthetic practice of resurgence. Religious practice, social practice, it's all of these things of kind of like drawing from the roots of your culture so that you can bring forth new life, new forms of life. And that is, I think that's just, we need to be able to think and talk about life in ways that don't reduce life to the way that it's been framed by the pro-life movement, or to eugenic discourses that are all about healthy, vibrant life. Like there are all kinds of like really insidious, racist, fascist discourses of life and vitality. But I don't think that we can leave that language to the right, because we need to live. And so natality and natal, I haven't totally learned the lesson of moving from resistance to resurgence, maybe because I feel myself to be still struggling to find, like, what are the roots that I am drawing life from as an uprooted person. But I think natal resistance and natal resurgence that's just kind of my mantra, certainly.
Thank you.
I was just wondering, by design, the reference was the same as, reminds me of Joe's reference to religion in terms of the word religio. What does that mean to bind
Yes.
to origin?
Yes.
Stand off it like what you described.
Yeah. And Levinas, one of my favorite philosophers, also breaks religion down that way. It's like rebinding. Mm-hmm.
I was wondering though, in terms of the discourse that you're developing, you've got, I think, a vocation to introduce me because there's just so much else to cover, and you need it topic of conversation or investigation. But where the Native American communities,
Yes.
in particularly the nations and peoples,
Yes.
have you fit into that this discourse, or has that been considered? Because obviously they've been highly subject to eugenics activities throughout the centuries.
Yes. So in the, I've done some work on this, but I need to do a lot more. Because this country is founded not only on the legacy of slavery and the eugenic discourses and practices around slavery, but also native genocide and also the control and manipulation of the biological and social reproductive capacities of Indigenous peoples. So I'm from Canada, and this is, we don't have, there was actually slavery practiced in Canada before it became its own country, because the British and the French practiced slavery, and they brought sort of like small scale, there's small scale practices of slavery, but the real legacy that in Canada any white settler needs to wrestle with and reckon with is the fact that we live on stolen and appropriated native land, and that our life there presupposes and is grounded on the genocide of native peoples. And so Andrea Smith and Leanne Simpson and Luana Ross have all written really beautifully and powerfully on making the connections between genocidal practices and carceral practices, which, you know, we can think of the prison as a site of incarceration, and the plantation, but we can also think of the reservation as a site, as a carceral site, and the forced removal of people from land as a practice of, I mean, I think we need to develop a very specific language about this, because we don't want to just sort of like apply. That's carceral too. But displacement and confinement and containment, like these sorts of movements, especially when it's perpetually kind of like you're squeezed further and further and further and put on the less and less valuable or apparently valuable land. And in Canada, we have a legacy of residential schools, which were also, I think, carceral institutions where children were removed from their families precisely and explicitly to kill the Indian and the child, and put in these residential schools which were rife with sexual and physical and emotional abuse, and also sites of explicit cultural genocide. And also many people died there. So there's a Truth and Reconciliation Commission going on right now in Canada around residential schools, which has, you know, very ambivalent supporters and critics, but it's one site of the negotiation, at least in Canada, of that inheritance. Because just as we have, I think, a responsibility and also a certain promise in reclaiming certain inheritances and building on those for resurgence, that those positive projects can't happen without also the negative critical project of dismantling both the silences of the way that settler colonial citizenship has been built on the decimation of native peoples and cultures and languages, and also the erasure of that structure. So that maybe that's why I'm still kind of attached to resistance as well as resurgence, because there's a negative movement of dismantling and a positive movement of building up and creating that is necessary.
Sorry, I'm gonna have to cut off the conversation. We promised 7 o'clock. I'll make it on. So will you all help me